His hands were rough, scarred from years of violence and survival, moving rhythmically as a strip of old leather slid across the blade of his steel knife. Lewis sat in the corner of a half-collapsed pavilion, his back pressed against cold metal, watching everything through eyes that never stopped calculating. The wind howled through gaps in the walls, carrying with it the stench of unwashed bodies and desperation. Around him, aliens and humans alike huddled in rags, their breath creating small clouds in the freezing air. Everyone was shivering, everyone except Lewis. His breathing remained steady, controlled, as if the cold was something that happened to other people. He scanned the crowd with the gaze of a predator checking exits, measuring threats, noting escape routes. Though to anyone watching, he simply looked like a man resting after a long day. The pavilion had once been something grander, back when this outpost still had pretensions of civilization. Now its walls were patchwork repairs of scrap metal and salvaged wood. The roof leaked in a dozen places. The floor was packed dirt mixed with frozen mud and things Lewis preferred not to think about. It was a trading post, or that was what the locals called it. Lewis had other names for it: den of misery, slave market, the last stop before hell. He had been here for 3 days, working odd jobs, moving cargo, breaking up fights when the owners needed muscle. It kept him fed, kept him sheltered, kept him invisible. That was the key to survival in places like this. Be useful but not memorable, strong but not threatening, present but not noticed. Lewis had mastered that balance years ago, back when he first found himself stranded on this frozen alien world with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knife in his hand. The pavilion was crowded today. Word had spread that a caravan was coming through, heading north to the mining colonies where bodies were always in demand and questions were never asked. That meant traders, slavers, opportunists of every species converging on this miserable spot, hoping to make a profit off someone else's desperation. Lewis had seen it before. He had survived it before. He would survive it again. His knife was sharp now, sharp enough to split a hair, but Lewis folded the leather strip and tucked it into his coat. The knife went back into its sheath at his belt, positioned where his right hand could reach it in less than a heartbeat. Old habits, good habits, the kind that kept you breathing when everyone around you was dying. Movement caught his eye. Lewis's gaze shifted to the scene unfolding near the main counter, where the pavilion's owner held court. A figure was approaching the counter, and even from across the room, Lewis could read the body language. Desperation, addiction, the shakes. The figure was an alien, one of the locals, with skin that had once been a healthy shade of blue, but was now mottled and gray from years of substance abuse. His hair was long, matted, filthy, hanging in clumps around a face that might have been handsome once, but was now just hollow. He was thin, too thin, his clothes hanging off him like fabric on a skeleton. Behind the alien, connected by a length of rusty chain, stumbled 2 small figures. Children. Lewis's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The alien father didn't look back at them, didn't acknowledge their existence. His eyes were locked on something in the slaver's hand, a bottle filled with murky yellowish liquid. Lewis recognized it. Korsh, local rot gut that could strip paint and melt brain cells in equal measure. The alien was practically salivating. The slaver was a different breed entirely. Stocky, muscular, with light-colored hair cropped close to his skull and skin that looked like tanned leather. He had the build of someone who spent his life breaking things, and the expression of someone who enjoyed it. His hands were massive, knuckles scarred from countless beatings. He held the bottle casually, watching the alien father the way a cat watches a wounded bird. Lewis could hear their conversation from across the room. The acoustics in the pavilion were strange, sound bouncing off metal and wood in unexpected ways. "You got something worth trading?" the slaver asked, his voice like gravel in a blender. The alien father thrust out the chain, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold it. "My daughters, good workers, young, healthy." The slaver looked past the father to the 2 small forms at the end of the chain. Lewis followed his gaze. The children were tiny, alien features delicate, despite their obvious malnutrition. The older one, maybe 5 years old, stood frozen with the kind of stillness that comes from learned terror. The younger one, perhaps 3, was moving restlessly, tugging at the collar around her neck, not yet understanding what was happening. "How old?" the slaver demanded. "5 and 3. The older one understands commands. The young one will learn." The slaver walked around the father, jerking the chain to pull the children closer. He grabbed the older girl's jaw, turning her head side to side, examining her like livestock. Lewis saw her flinch but not resist. Already trained, already broken. "Skinny?" the slaver said. "Half starved. Look at these ribs. They eat little, cheap to feed." The slaver grunted. "1 bottle." "2, the father said, his voice cracking with need. "Look at them. They're worthless. 1 bottle. Final offer." The alien father's resistance crumbled instantly. Yes, 1 bottle. Please." The exchange happened quickly. The slaver tossed the bottle, and the father caught it with the desperate coordination of the truly addicted. He was already fumbling with the cap, already bringing it to his lips, as the slaver wrapped the chain around his meaty fist, testing its weight, checking his new property. Through a gap in the pavilion wall, Lewis could see across the frozen wasteland to where a single pine tree stood about a kilometer away. Some of the locals had decorated it with salvaged ornaments and a string of old electric lights that barely glowed. It was the only spot of color in the gray-white landscape, a pathetic gesture toward holiday cheer in a world that had no room for such things. The younger child, Batika, was straining toward it, her small hand reaching out as if she could touch those distant lights. The older one, Amini, stood still, but Lewis could see her eyes fixed on the tree as well. They understood that it represented something, even if they couldn't articulate what. Safety, warmth, home, everything they were about to lose forever. The slaver gave the chain a sharp yank. "Move!" Amini was still staring at the tree, caught in that moment of childhood wonder that survives even in the worst circumstances. She didn't react fast enough. Her small body jerked forward, and she stumbled, her feet tangling. Instead of giving her a second to recover, the slaver laughed, a harsh bark of amusement, and kicked her in the back. Not gently, not a mere push, a real kick, the kind meant to hurt, to establish dominance, to make clear the new order of things. Amini fell face first into the snow that had blown in through the pavilion's broken walls and collected in drifts along the floor. Lewis heard the impact, saw her small body hit the frozen ground. When she pushed herself up, there was blood on her lip, bright blue against her pale skin, dripping onto the white snow. The contrast was stark, vivid, impossible to ignore. Something in Lewis's chest tightened. He had spent years building walls, learning not to care, teaching himself that in a world this brutal, the only way to survive was to look after yourself and let everyone else burn. He had watched terrible things happen to people who didn't deserve it. He had walked away from cries for help because helping meant dying. He had made peace with being the kind of man who did nothing. But there was blood on the snow. Blue blood. A child's blood. And somewhere in the calcified wasteland of Lewis's soul, something cracked. His face remained neutral, but his eyes had gone cold. That particular kind of cold that preceded violence. The knife he had been cleaning is suddenly in his hand again, though he didn't remember drawing it. His body was moving before his brain had fully processed the decision, acting on instinct and rage, and something he had thought was long dead. Lewis stood. His hand moved in a sharp practice motion. The knife left his fingers, spinning through the air in a flat trajectory that cut through the pavilion's dim interior like a streak of silver lightning. The sound when it hit was wet and solid at the same time, metal punching through meat and pinning flesh to wood. The slaver's scream cut through every other sound in the pavilion. He stared down at his hand, now nailed to the wooden support beam of the counter, the knife buried through his palm and out the other side, blood welling up around the blade. Blue blood, darker than the children's, almost purple. He tried to pull his hand free and screamed again as pain flared white hot. The pavilion erupted in chaos. Everyone was moving, shouting, reaching for weapons. Lewis was already in motion. He didn't move with the grace of a trained fighter, all flowing technique and precise strikes. He moved like a brawler, like someone who had learned to fight in alleys and bars and prison yards, where the only rule was survive. One of the slaver's guards came at him with a spear, the point aimed at Lewis's gut. Lewis pivoted, not away, but into the attack, getting inside the weapon's reach before the guard could adjust. His hand shot out and grabbed the spear shaft, yanking it down while driving his knee up into the guard's face. Bone crunched. Blood sprayed. The guard stumbled back, and Lewis was already moving to the next threat. Another guard, this one with a short sword, slashed at Lewis's head. Lewis ducked, feeling the wind of the blade's passage, and came up inside the guard's defense. He didn't have a weapon in his hands, but his hands were weapons. He drove his palm into the guard's throat, crushing the windpipe, then swept the guard's legs and brought his boot down on the alien's knee. The joint bent the wrong way with a sound like snapping wood. The guard went down and didn't get up. A third guard tried to tackle Lewis from the side. Lewis saw him coming in his peripheral vision, turned into the tackle and wrapped his arm around the guard's neck, using the alien's momentum to flip him over his hip. The guard hit the ground hard, and Lewis followed him down, driving his elbow into the alien's face once, twice, 3 times until the struggling stopped. The whole thing took maybe 15 seconds. 3 guards down, 1 slaver pinned to a post, and Lewis standing in the center of the pavilion with blood on his hands and ice in his eyes. The crowd that had been pressing in suddenly backed away, giving him space, recognizing Predator when they saw it. Lewis turned and ran toward where the children were still chained. They were huddled together, Betika crying, Amini trying to shield her younger sister with her own small body. Lewis didn't slow down. He pulled a short, heavy blade from his belt, the kind meant for chopping more than cutting, and brought it down on the chain's corroded lock. The lock was old, weak, and it shattered on the first strike. The chain fell away, clattering to the frozen ground. Lewis didn't comfort them, didn't explain, didn't waste time with words. He grabbed both children by the collars of their ragged clothing, lifting them partially off the ground. They weighed almost nothing. "Run if you want to live," he growled, his voice harsh and urgent. Then he was moving, dragging them toward the back of the pavilion where a gap in the wall led out into the frozen wasteland beyond. Behind them, Lewis heard the slaver finally wrench the knife free from his hand with a howl of agony. "Kill them," the slaver roared. "Kill the human! Bring me the merchandise!" Lewis didn't look back. He shoved the children through the gap in the wall and followed them out into the blinding white of the frozen landscape. The wind hit like a physical force, driving snow and ice into their faces. Lewis grabbed the children again, one under each arm, and started running. He could hear shouting behind him, voices organizing, weapons being gathered. Then he heard something worse. Howling. Mbuhanewang. Not human howling, not even alien howling. Something bestial, hungry, eager. Lewis glanced back and saw the slaver standing in the pavilion entrance, his wounded hand wrapped in cloth, his other hand pointing at the snow where Amini's blue blood had dripped from her split lip. 3 creatures emerged from a pen beside the pavilion. They looked like something evolution had designed specifically to kill. They had the general shape of dogs or wolves, but there the similarity ended. Their skin was thick, hairless, a deep midnight blue that seemed to absorb light. Their heads were broad and flat, jaws massive, filled with not 1 but 2 rows of teeth designed for tearing and crushing. They moved with a horrible fluid grace, muscles rippling under that thick skin. The slaver was letting them smell the blood trail, giving them the scent. Lewis cursed under his breath. He knew these creatures. The locals called them blue hounds, though they were no more Oz than sharks were goldfish. They were trackers, hunters, killers. Once they had your scent, they didn't stop. They didn't tire. They didn't give up. And they were fast, far faster than a human carrying 2 children through deep snow. Lewis adjusted his grip on Betika and Amini and ran harder. Behind him, he heard the slaver release the hounds with a sharp whistle. The howling grew louder, more excited. The hunt was on. Lewis didn't follow the trail, didn't head for the road that would have given him easier footing and faster progress. Instead, he turned directly toward the mountains, toward the deep snow that had accumulated in massive drifts against the foothills. The children were light, but running through snow this deep was like running through water, every step an effort, every movement burning energy Lewis couldn't afford to waste. But he had a plan. Those hounds were heavy, built for power, not endurance. The deep snow would slow them down, make them work for every step, tire them out. Lewis was human, had human endurance, The kind of stubborn persistence that had let his ancestors chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. He could do this. He had to do this. Betika was crying, the sound muffled against Lewis's coat. Amity was silent, but he could feel her small body trembling. They were terrified, in shock, barely understanding what was happening. Lewis wanted to tell them it would be okay, wanted to offer some comfort, but he didn't believe in lying to children, and he had no idea if they would survive the next hour, let alone make it to safety. The snow got deeper as they moved away from the settlement. Lewis was breaking trail now, using his body weight and momentum to plow through drifts that sometimes came up to his waist. The children were above the snow, held in his arms, but they could feel every jarring step, every stumble, every moment when Lewis's boot hit ice under the snow and almost sent them all tumbling. Behind them, the howling changed pitch. The hounds had reached the deep snow and were slowing down, just as Lewis had predicted. But they weren't stopping. Nothing would stop them except death or loss of the scent, and Lewis was leaving a trail a blind man could follow. He pushed on, his lungs burning, his legs screaming, his body demanding rest that he couldn't afford to give it. The mountains rose ahead of them, dark and jagged against the pale sky. Lewis was heading for the rocks, for the places where snow couldn't accumulate as deeply, where the terrain would be too rough for the hounds to move at full speed. He just had to get there before the hunters caught up. They reached an outcropping of dark stone, and Lewis finally let the children down, pushing them behind the rock. Betika collapsed immediately, sitting in the snow and crying. Amity stayed standing, her eyes huge in her small face, darting between Lewis and the direction they had come from. She could hear the hounds now, closer than before, the sound echoing off the rocks in strange ways that made it hard to judge distance. Lewis drew his knife, the one he had been sharpening back in the pavilion. His hands were steady despite the cold and exertion. He looked at Betika, saw her crying, saw the way her small body was shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. The sound was carrying in the cold air, echoing, advertising their position like a beacon. Lewis dropped to his knees in front of Betika. His movement was so sudden and decisive that both children flinched. He reached out and clamped his hand over Betika's mouth, not gently but not cruelly either, just firm enough to cut off the sound. His other hand gripped her shoulder, holding her in place. He leaned close, his eyes locking onto hers. "Silence is life," he said, his voice low and hard. "Screaming is death. Choose." Betika's eyes were pools of terror, but Lewis didn't soften his expression, didn't smile or try to comfort. He needed her to understand that this wasn't a game, wasn't something she could cry her way out of. He kept his hand over her mouth, kept his eyes locked on hers, until he felt the change in her. The moment when the child disappeared and something harder, something more primal, something focused purely on survival took its place. She nodded, just a tiny movement of her head. Lewis slowly removed his hand. Betika's mouth trembled, her eyes still brimmed with tears, but she didn't make a sound. Amity stood beside her sister, one hand on Betika's shoulder, and Lewis saw the same hardness in her eyes. They understood now. They were learning the most important lesson of this world. Weakness kills you. Lewis stood and surveyed their surroundings. They were in sparse forest now, stunted trees clinging to the mountainside, their branches bare and skeletal. The hounds would be here in minutes, and the hunters wouldn't be far behind. Lewis couldn't outrun them forever, not carrying two children. He needed to slow them down, needed to buy time. He moved quickly through the trees, looking for specific shapes, specific sizes. He found what he needed: straight branches, thumb-thick hardwood that wouldn't snap easily. He used his knife to sharpen them into crude spears, working with practiced efficiency. Each point was honed to vicious sharpness, each shaft cut to optimal length. Amity watched him work, her eyes tracking his movements. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Making them pay for following us," Lewis replied. He didn't explain further, didn't have time. He took the sharpened stakes and moved back toward the trail they had left. He found a narrow section where the trees grew close together and the snow was particularly deep. Perfect. Lewis pushed the stakes into the snow at an angle, points facing back toward where they had come from, positioned so they were hidden just beneath the surface. He worked quickly, setting half a dozen of them in a rough line across the path. It was a simple trap, crude, the kind of thing humans had been using to hunt and kill since before recorded history. But simple didn't mean ineffective. He returned to where the children waited, grabbed them both, and moved 50 meters up the slope, finding another outcropping where they could hide and watch. He pulled them down behind the rocks and wrapped his arms around them, partly for warmth and partly to keep them still and quiet. They huddled against him, and Lewis could feel the cold radiating from their small bodies. Alien physiology, not adapted for this kind of cold. They were dying slowly, hypothermia setting in. He would need to find shelter soon, or they wouldn't survive the night. But first, they needed to survive the next few minutes. The howling grew louder. Lewis could see movement through the trees now, 3 dark shapes loping through the snow with horrible determination. The blue hounds had their scent, and nothing would distract them from it. Behind the hounds, still distant but visible, Lewis could see the hunters, the slaver and 4 of his men, moving more slowly but just as determined. The first hound reached the narrow section of trail where Lewis had set his trap. It was moving fast, excited by the fresh scent, and it never saw the danger. The creature's chest hit the first stake dead center, the sharpened wood punching through its thick hide and into vital organs. The hound's momentum carried it forward, driving the stake deeper, and its howl of pursuit turned into a shriek of agony. The second hound tried to avoid its fallen packmate, veering to the side, and hit another stake. This one took the creature in the shoulder, not a killing blow but crippling, sending the hound tumbling into the snow where it thrashed and bled. The third hound managed to leap over its injured companions, but its landing was off balance, and one of the hunters following behind wasn't as lucky. The man tripped over the first fallen hound and went down hard, his own momentum carrying him face first into one of the remaining stakes. The wood punched through his cheek and out the back of his skull. He died without even having time to scream. Chaos erupted in the hunting party. The slaver was roaring orders, trying to get his remaining men organized, but they were spooked now, realizing they were dealing with someone who knew how to kill, someone who was turning this frozen wasteland into a death trap. Lewis didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't feel satisfaction. He simply noted that the odds had improved slightly, then gathered the children and moved deeper into the mountains. Every minute counted, every bit of distance was precious. The sun was setting now, the temperature dropping from merely brutal to potentially lethal. Lewis found a deep crevice in the rocks, barely large enough for the 3 of them, and pushed the children inside. The wind was screaming past the opening, but inside the crevice they were sheltered from the worst of it. Amity was shaking uncontrollably now, her lips taking on a darker blue shade that Lewis recognized as the alien equivalent of hypothermia. Betica was worse, barely conscious, her eyes rolling back in her head. They were dying. Lewis had bought them time by slowing the hunters, but he was going to lose them to the cold. He did the only thing he could think of. Lewis unbuttoned his heavy coat, the one he had traded 2 months of labor for, the one that had kept him alive through 3 winters on this planet. He pulled both children against his chest, their small bodies pressed against his skin, and wrapped the coat around all 3 of them. The difference was immediate and shocking. Human body temperature ran hot compared to most species, and Lewis's metabolism was burning through calories at a furious rate to maintain warmth in this cold. To the freezing alien children, he felt like a furnace, like being pressed against a living fire. They instinctively curled closer, seeking that heat, and Lewis wrapped his arms around them, using his body as a shield against the killing cold. It was insane. Humans weren't meant to survive this temperature either, not without proper gear. Lewis could feel the cold seeping into his extremities, could feel his fingers going numb, could feel his own body beginning to shut down non-essential systems to preserve core temperature. He was sacrificing his own survival to keep these children alive, and the logical part of his brain was screaming at him that this was stupid, that he should let them go, that he should save himself. But Lewis had been a lot of things in his life. He had been a fighter, a survivor, a man who did what he had to do to stay breathing. But somewhere along the way, in all the violence and desperation and horror, he had lost something essential. He had lost the part of himself that made him human, rather than just another predator. Maybe this was his chance to get it back. The night was endless, a frozen eternity of darkness and wind and pain. Lewis drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting to stay awake, knowing that sleep in this cold meant death. The children were warmer now, their trembling reduced to occasional shivers, their breathing more steady. But Lewis was paying the price for their warmth, his own body temperature dropping dangerously low. He thought about the past, about how he had ended up on this planet. A transport ship, carrying human prisoners to a mining colony, an attack by raiders, the ship breaking apart in an atmosphere. Lewis waking up in the wreckage with a concussion and a broken arm, surrounded by bodies, alone on a world that had no reason to welcome humans and every reason to kill them. That had been 4 years ago. 4 years of surviving, of fighting, of doing whatever it took to see another sunrise. 4 years of becoming harder, colder, more ruthless. 4 years of telling himself that caring about anyone else was a luxury he couldn't afford. And then a drunk alien had sold his children for a bottle of rotgut, and Lewis had thrown away 4 years of survival instinct because he saw blood on snow, and something inside him refused to accept it. He wondered if he was finally losing his mind, if 4 years of isolation and violence had broken something in his brain. If he was going to die on this mountain holding 2 alien children he had known for less than a day, and if anyone would ever even know his name. But dawn came anyway, indifferent to Lewis's existential crisis. The sun rose over the mountains, weak and pale, but still warming, still offering the promise of life. Lewis forced his eyes open, forced his numbed hands to move, forced himself to check on the children. They were alive, breathing steadily, their skin color healthier than it had been. They had survived the night. All 3 of them had survived. Lewis allowed himself a moment of pure relief, then pushed it away. Survival was measured in hours here, not days. They had made it through one night, but they weren't safe yet. The hunters might have turned back, or they might be waiting for dawn to resume the chase. Lewis needed to move, needed to get the children somewhere secure before their luck ran out. He unwrapped his coat from around them, and the cold hit like a slap. Amity woke up immediately, her eyes snapping open, her body tensing for danger. Betica took longer, her small body reluctant to leave the warmth. Lewis helped them out of the crevice, his movements slow and stiff from the cold and from spending the night in a cramped position. He checked his weapons, his knife, a short sword he had taken from one of the guards back at the pavilion, a length of rope he kept coiled on his belt. Not much, but it had kept him alive this long. He checked the children, making sure they could walk, making sure they weren't showing signs of frostbite or serious injury. Lewis reached down and pulled a second knife from his boot, a smaller blade with a bone handle. He didn't give it to Betica. She was too young, too small, would probably hurt herself before she hurt anyone else. But Amini was 5, old enough to understand, old enough to learn. Lewis crouched down in front of her and held out the knife. "Take it," he said. Amini stared at the blade, then at Lewis, her eyes uncertain. "Take it," Lewis repeated. He waited until her small hand closed around the handle, then wrapped his larger hand around hers, positioning her fingers correctly. He moved her arm in a slow arc, demonstrating the motion of an upward thrust. "They have an artery here," Lewis said, touching his own neck to show her. "Hit them there, and they die. Fast. Don't think about it. Don't hesitate. Someone tries to hurt you, you put this blade in their neck. Understand?" Amini's eyes were huge, horrified, but she nodded slowly. Lewis saw the moment the last bit of childhood innocence died in those eyes, replaced by cold necessity. He had just taught a 5-year-old how to kill. In any civilized world, he would be a monster for it. But this wasn't a civilized world, and the only monsters here were the ones who sold children for alcohol. Lewis stood, surveying their surroundings. The mountain pass stretched ahead of them, leading to the high peaks and the valleys beyond. It was called the Dead Zone by locals, and with good reason. The temperatures up there were lethal even for cold-adapted species. But it was also the fastest route away from the settlements, and Lewis was willing to bet that their pursuers would hesitate before following them into that frozen hell. They started walking. Lewis led the way, breaking trail through the snow, the children following in his footsteps. The wind picked up as they climbed, growing stronger with every step, until it was a physical force trying to push them back down the mountain. Lewis leaned into it, using his weight and strength to force his way forward. Behind him, the children struggled, but they didn't complain, didn't cry, didn't beg to stop. They had learned the lesson Lewis had taught them: weakness kills. The pass narrowed as they climbed, becoming a thin ledge between sheer drops on either side. Lewis kept the children close to the rock wall, away from the edge where one gust of wind could send them tumbling into oblivion. The footing was treacherous, ice coating the rocks, and Lewis had to test every step before committing his weight. He heard a sound behind them and turned to look back down the pass. There, still distant but climbing steadily, were their pursuers. The slaver and 4 of his men, without the hounds now but still armed and still determined. Lewis cursed under his breath. He had hoped the traps in the night would convince them to give up, but apparently the children were valuable enough to make this chase worth it. Or maybe it was personal now. Lewis had killed the slaver's men, humiliated him in front of his crew, cost him money and reputation. Men like that didn't forgive easily. They would chase Lewis and the children to the ends of this frozen world if that was what it took. Lewis looked ahead, scanning the terrain for advantages, for anything he could use. His eyes settled on an unstable-looking pile of rocks and ice perched above the narrow trail. It was held in place by an old tree trunk that had somehow taken root in this inhospitable place, its wood weathered and bent by years of wind. An idea formed. Brutal, simple, effective. Lewis turned to the children. "Press against the rock," he ordered. "Don't move until I tell you." They obeyed without question, flattening themselves against the stone wall. Lewis moved to the old tree trunk, examining it, judging angles and weight distribution. The pile of rocks and ice above was massive, hundreds of pounds of material held in precarious balance. If that trunk moved, if the balance shifted, everything would come down. And below them, on the narrow trail, their pursuers were climbing steadily closer. Lewis positioned himself, braced his back against the rock wall, and placed his boots against the tree trunk. Every muscle in his body tensed. His legs were the strongest part of him, capable of generating tremendous force, and he was going to need every bit of it. He pushed, nothing happened. The trunk was old, weathered, but still solid, wedged firmly into place. Lewis pushed harder, his face reddening with effort, veins standing out on his neck. Still nothing. The pursuers were getting closer. Lewis could hear them now, hear the crunch of their boots in the snow, hear their labored breathing in the thin air. Lewis closed his eyes, reached deep into himself for reserves he wasn't sure he had, and pushed again. This time something gave. A crack, subtle but distinct. The trunk shifted just a fraction of an inch. Lewis didn't stop, didn't give the wood time to settle. He kept pushing, kept applying pressure, his legs burning with the effort, his back screaming in protest. The trunk shifted again, farther this time. Then it moved all at once, breaking free from whatever had held it in place. The pile above lost its support, and gravity took over. Rocks, ice, frozen debris, all of it came loose in a roaring avalanche of destruction. Lewis pressed himself against the wall next to the children as the slide roared past them, missing them by feet, continuing down the trail in a growing wave of stone and ice. Below, one of the pursuers looked up, saw death coming, and tried to run. He managed 3 steps before the slide caught him, smashing him against the rock wall and then carrying him over the edge. Another pursuer tried to climb to safety, scrabbling up the rock face, but the slide was too fast, too massive. It swept him away like he weighed nothing, and his screaming cut off abruptly as he disappeared over the cliff. The remaining 3 pursuers managed to climb to safety, pressing themselves into crevices in the rock, letting the slide pass them. But when it was over, 2 of their number were gone, crushed or thrown into the abyss. The slaver stood on the trail, staring up at where Lewis and the children were visible on the ledge above. Even from this distance, Lewis could see the fury on the alien's face. But the slaver was hesitating now. He could see what Lewis had done, could see the terrain being turned into a weapon against him. And his men were scared. They had signed on for a simple slave recovery, not a running battle with a human who fought like the mountain itself was on his side. Lewis didn't wait to see what they would decide. He grabbed the children and kept climbing, pushing toward the highest part of the pass. The air was thin up here, and even Lewis was feeling it, his lungs working overtime to extract enough oxygen. The children were suffering worse, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. But they were close now. Lewis could see the top of the pass ahead, see where the trail curved around a final outcropping, and then began its descent into the valley beyond. Just a little farther, just a few more steps. The sound of pursuit resumed behind them. Lewis glanced back and saw the slaver and his two remaining men climbing again, refusing to give up, driven by greed or pride or simple stubbornness. They were moving slower than before, the cold and altitude taking their toll, but they were still coming. Lewis and the children reached the top of the Heflon. The view from there was stunning. Mountains stretching away in all directions, valleys deep in shadow, the sun casting long golden rays across the landscape. In other circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Right now, it was just another obstacle to survival. The slaver reached the top of the pass a few minutes later. He stood there, breathing hard, his wounded hand clutched against his chest. His two men flanked him, weapons drawn but their postures uncertain. They were at the limits of their endurance, the cold sapping their strength, the altitude making every breath a struggle. Lewis was 20 feet away, standing between them and the children. He had his sword in his hand now, the blade clean and sharp, ready for use. His coat was torn. His face was cut in half a dozen places from wind-blown ice. His clothes were soaked with melted snow. He looked like he had been through a war. He looked like he had won. The slaver and Lewis locked eyes. No words were needed. This was going to end one way or another, right here, right now. The slaver raised his weapon, a heavy axe with a blade that had seen plenty of use. His men moved to flank Lewis, trying to surround him. Lewis didn't wait for them to get into position. He attacked first, exploding forward with sudden violence, closing the distance before the slaver could react. His sword came up in a brutal arc aimed at the slaver's neck. The slaver barely got his axe up in time to block, the weapons meeting with a crash of metal. Lewis pressed the attack, driving forward, using his superior strength and the slaver's wounded hand against him. He kicked at the slaver's knee, trying to cripple him, but the alien twisted away, bringing his axe around in a counterstrike that Lewis had to duck under. One of the slaver's men came at Lewis from the side, swinging a sword. Lewis couldn't dodge both attacks, so he didn't try. He stepped into the man's swing, taking the blade across his shoulder instead of his neck. Pain flared white hot, and Lewis felt warm blood running down his arm. But he was inside the man's guard now, too close for weapons. Lewis headbutted the man, breaking his nose, then grabbed him and threw him into the slaver, sending both of them stumbling. The second man tried to spear Lewis in the back. Lewis heard him coming, spun, caught the spear shaft, and yanked it forward, pulling the man off balance. Lewis's knee came up into the man's face, then his elbow came down on the back of the man's neck. The man collapsed into the snow and didn't move. Lewis was bleeding badly now, the wound in his shoulder deeper than he had thought. His left arm was weakening, going numb from blood loss and cold. The slaver saw it, saw the weakness, and pressed his advantage. He came at Lewis with the axe, swinging in powerful arcs that Lewis could barely deflect. Lewis gave ground, backing toward the edge of the pass, toward the drop-off. The slaver followed, sensing victory. One more good hit, and the human would go down, and then the slaver would take his time with the kill, make it slow, make it painful, make it a lesson to anyone who thought they could defy him. Lewis's boot hit ice at the edge of the drop-off. The slaver saw it, smiled, and brought his axe up for a final strike. Lewis waited, timed it perfectly, and then at the last second he threw himself backward off the edge. But he didn't fall alone. As he went over, Lewis's hand shot out and grabbed the slaver by the front of his coat. The slaver's eyes widened in shock and terror as he realized what was happening. Lewis's weight pulled him forward, pulled him over the edge, and for a moment they were both falling through empty air. Then Lewis's free hand caught the edge of the cliff, his fingers digging into ice and rock, his shoulders screaming in protest. His body slammed against the rock face, but he held on. The slaver was still clutching his coat, dangling over the abyss, nothing but Lewis's grip between him and a long fall. Lewis looked into the slaver's eyes, saw the terror there, saw the pleading. The slaver's mouth moved, trying to form words, trying to beg. Lewis's face remained cold, expressionless. With a deliberate motion, he released his grip on the slaver's coat. The slaver fell, his scream echoing off the rocks, growing fainter and fainter until it cut off abruptly. Lewis didn't watch him hit. He was already pulling himself up, using what little remained of his strength to haul his body back over the edge. He collapsed on the snow at the top of the pass, gasping for breath, his wounded shoulder burning like fire. The last remaining man of the slaver's crew stood a few feet away, watching. Lewis struggled to his knees, reaching for his sword, ready to keep fighting. But the man dropped his weapon. He looked at Lewis, at the blood in the snow, at the bodies of his dead companions, at the empty air where his employer had just disappeared. He looked at the children, standing like frozen statues, watching everything with wide eyes. Then he looked back at Lewis, at this human who had killed half a dozen trained fighters, who had survived the dead zone, who had just dragged his enemy to hell with him rather than die alone. The man turned and started walking back down the trail. Not running, not attacking, just walking away. Choosing survival over vengeance, choosing retreat over honor. Lewis watched him go, not trusting it, not relaxing until the man disappeared around a bend in the trail. Then and only then did Lewis allow himself to collapse completely. He lay in the snow, breathing hard, his body shaking with exhaustion and blood loss and cold. He could feel his consciousness starting to slip away, shock setting in from the wound in his shoulder and the incredible stress he had put his body through. He fumbled at his belt, found his flask of alcohol. He had been saving it, not for drinking, but for exactly this situation. Lewis unscrewed the cap with his teeth, positioned the flask over his wounded shoulder, and poured. The alcohol hit the open wound and pain exploded through him, white hot and all-consuming. He bit down on a scream, turning it into a hiss of air through clenched teeth. But the pain meant the wound was being clean, meant infection was less likely, meant he might survive this. Lewis tore a strip from his already ruined shirt and used it to bind the wound, pulling the knot tight with his teeth in his one good hand. It wouldn't win any prizes for medical technique, but it would keep him from bleeding out. Probably. He became aware of the children approaching. Amity was in the lead, with Betica half hiding behind her older sister. They stood in front of Lewis, looking down at him. Their eyes had changed over the past day and night. The fear was still there, but it was mixed now with something else. Understanding, maybe. Or respect. They had seen Lewis fight, had seen him win against impossible odds, had seen him keep going when any sane person would have quit. Amity picked up Lewis's sword from where it had fallen in the snow. She held it with both hands, the blade heavy and awkward for her small frame, and carried it over to him. She placed it carefully on the ground next to Lewis, then stepped back. Lewis looked at her, at this 5-year-old alien child who less than 2 days ago had been a slave, and saw a survivor staring back at him. Amity touched the bone-handled knife Lewis had given her, tucked securely in her belt now, a weapon she knew how to use. Betica was clinging to her sister, but she wasn't crying anymore, wasn't making noise. She had learned the first rule: silence is survival. Lewis forced himself to sit up, then stand. Every muscle protested, every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his wounded shoulder. He sheathed his sword, adjusted his coat, checked his remaining weapons. He looked back the way they had come, but there was no sign of pursuit. The remaining mercenary had either kept going or died trying to make it back down the mountain. Lewis turned to face forward, toward the descent, toward the valley that lay beyond the dead zone. He could see it stretching out below them, a vast expanse of frozen forest and snow-covered plains. Somewhere down there would be shelter, maybe a settlement, maybe other survivors. Somewhere down there was a future that might last more than a day or two. Betica couldn't walk anymore. She was standing, but barely, swaying on her feet. Lewis bent down and she practically fell into his arms. He lifted her onto his left shoulder, the one that wasn't wounded, and she wrapped her small arms around his neck. Amity moved to his side, one hand gripping his coat, ready to walk. Lewis looked at the sun, now fully risen, casting long shadows across the mountain peaks. He looked at the valley below, so far away, so hard to reach. He looked at the 2 small lives he had somehow become responsible for. Then he pointed with his sword, indicating the direction they would go, and started walking. The descent was brutal. The trail was steep, treacherous with ice, and Lewis's wounded shoulder made balance difficult. Several times he slipped, managing to catch himself at the last second, protecting Bedica from the impact. Amini never complained, never asked to stop, just kept walking with a determination that was almost frightening in someone so young. They walked through the morning, stopping only briefly when absolutely necessary. Lewis rationed the little food he had, giving most of it to the children. They needed it more than he did. He could go days without eating if he had to. He had done it before. By midday, they had descended below the worst of the cold. The wind was less fierce here, the temperature marginally warmer. Lewis allowed himself to hope that they might actually survive this. They were out of the dead zone, past the point where their pursuers could follow, and moving toward the lowlands where settlements were possible. In the early afternoon, they found a stream, not frozen solid like everything else, but actually flowing, the water cold but liquid. Lewis had the children drink first, then drank himself, the water so cold it hurt his teeth, but tasting better than anything he could remember. He used the water to clean his wound again, gritting his teeth against the pain. The bleeding had mostly stopped, the makeshift bandage doing its job. Lewis examined it critically, checking for signs of infection, but so far it looked clean. He might lose some function in the arm, might have a nasty scar, but he would live. As the sun started to descend toward the horizon, Lewis spotted something in the distance. Smoke. Not much, just a thin column rising from what looked like a cluster of structures nestled in the valley. A settlement of some kind. Lewis adjusted their course, heading toward it. It might be friendly, might be hostile, but right now he had no choice. They needed shelter, food, warmth. They needed to stop running. They reached the settlement as darkness was falling. It was small, maybe 20 buildings scattered around a central square, surrounded by a makeshift wall of logs and scrap metal. Lewis approached cautiously, one hand on his sword, ready for anything. A guard appeared at the gate, an alien with pale blue skin and suspicious eyes. He looked at Lewis, at the human's torn clothes and bloody shoulder, at the two small children clinging to him. "What do you want?" "Shelter," Lewis said simply. "Food. We can work for it." The guard studied them for a long moment, then turned and called something in a language Lewis didn't understand. Another figure appeared, this one taller, with an air of authority. The settlement leader, Lewis guessed. The leader looked at the three of them with calculating eyes. "You're the human everyone is talking about, the one who killed Varkesh and his crew." Lewis said nothing. Confirmation would be dangerous. Denial would be a lie. He just met the leader's gaze steadily, waiting. The leader smiled slightly. "Varkesh was a bastard, owed me money. I'd say his death settles that debt." He gestured toward the gate. "Come in. We have rules here, but if you can follow them, you can stay. The children, too." Lewis nodded, then carried Bedica through the gate with Amini walking beside him. The settlement wasn't much, just another collection of desperate survivors trying to eke out an existence on this frozen world. But it was shelter. It was warm food. It was a chance to rest and heal. As they were led toward one of the buildings, Lewis felt Betica's grip on his neck tighten, felt Amini's hand clutch his coat more firmly. They were scared, uncertain of this new place, these new people. Lewis understood. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. They had learned that lesson well. But Lewis also understood something else. Something he hadn't expected when he threw that knife across the pavilion what felt like a lifetime ago. He had given these children more than rescue. He had given them a chance. And in doing so, he had given himself something he thought was lost forever. Purpose. The next day settled into a rhythm. Lewis worked where work was needed, using his strength and skills to earn their keep. He repaired the settlement's walls, hauled supplies, broke up fights when the leader needed muscle. In return, they had a place to sleep, food to eat, and relative safety. The children were given a small room in one of the communal buildings. At night, they slept together, Bedica curling against Amini, the two of them seeking comfort in each other's presence. Lewis slept nearby, not in the same room, but close enough to hear if they called out, close enough to respond if danger came. Amini started following Lewis during the day, watching him work, learning. She still had the knife he had given her, tucked into her belt, and she practiced with it when she thought no one was watching. Lewis would sometimes stop what he was doing and show her a better grip, a more effective strike, correcting her technique with the same matter-of-fact directness he used for everything. Betika was slowly coming back from the shock, her personality emerging in small bursts. She would smile sometimes, would play with the other children in the settlement, though she never strayed far from Amini or Louis. The trauma would be with her forever, Louis knew, but she was young enough that maybe, just maybe, she could grow beyond it. One evening, about a week after they arrived at the settlement, Louis was sitting outside his quarters, sharpening his knife like he always did. Amini approached and sat down beside him, watching his hands move in their familiar rhythm. "Why did you save us?" she asked suddenly. Louis continued his work, the blade moving steadily across the whetstone. "Saw something I couldn't ignore. But people get sold all the time. People buy all the time. You could have walked away." Louis paused, considering the question. Why had he done it? He still wasn't entirely sure himself. "Your blood was blue on white snow," he said finally. "Made me remember that some things are worth fighting for." Amini was quiet for a moment. "Will you teach me to fight? Really fight like you do?" Louis looked at her, at this small alien child who had seen too much, who had learned too young that the universe was cruel and unforgiving. He should say no. He should let her be a child for as long as possible, protect her from the darkness. But this universe didn't care about should. This universe cared about survival. "Yes," Louis said. "I'll teach you." And he did. Every morning before the settlement woke, Louis would take Amini out to a clear space and show her how to move, how to balance, how to turn her body into a weapon when weapons weren't available. He taught her dirty fighting, street fighting, the kind of techniques that kept you breathing when everything was going wrong. Betika would sometimes watch, too young to participate but learning anyway, absorbing the lessons. Louis was careful with them, never pushing too hard, never forcing them to do more than they were ready for. But he was firm, insistent that they learn, because he knew that one day he might not be there to protect them. Weeks turned into months. Winter deepened, the cold settling in like a permanent presence. The settlement endured as it always did, the residents going about their daily routines of survival with weary determination. Louis became a fixture there, the human who worked hard, asked for little, and had killed a slaver barehanded on a mountain pass. People gave him respect, or at least the kind of wary distance that served as respect in places like this. The children were accepted too, the settlement having seen enough orphans and refugees that two more didn't cause much comment. They were fed, sheltered, safe as anyone could be in this world. But Louis knew it couldn't last forever. Nothing did. The people who ran the slave trade were organized, connected, and they didn't forget. Eventually, someone would come looking for the human who had cost them money and reputation. Eventually, they would have to move again. Louis didn't tell the children this. They were happy here, or as happy as they could be given everything they had experienced. He let them have this time, this brief moment of peace and normalcy. But he also made sure they were ready, that they kept training, that they remembered the lessons he had taught them on that frozen mountain. One morning, several months after they had arrived, Louis woke to find Amini standing in his doorway. She wasn't panicked, wasn't scared, just stood there with an expression that said she had something important to tell him. "There are strangers at the gate," she said, asking about a human and two children. Louis was on his feet instantly, his hand going to his sword. "How many?" "6, maybe more outside the walls." Louis nodded, his mind already calculating. 6 was manageable if he had surprise. More than 6 got complicated. "Get Betika, pack light, be ready to move fast." Amini disappeared without another word. Louis gathered his minimal belongings, weapons, some dried food, a water skin, the few possessions he had accumulated that were worth keeping. Everything fit in a small pack that he could abandon in seconds if necessary. He found the children waiting at the back of the building, both of them ready, both of them silent. Betika looked scared but determined. Amini had her knife out, held properly, ready to use. They had learned well. Louis led them through the settlement's back ways, avoiding the main paths. He could hear raised voices from the direction of the gate, an argument brewing. The settlement leader was probably trying to decide if protecting Louis and the children was worth potential trouble. Louis didn't blame him. "In this world, you looked after your own interests first. They reached the back wall where Lewis had noted a weak spot weeks ago and had deliberately not repaired it. Insurance, he had thought then. Good instincts. Lewis pried the loose boards aside, creating an opening just large enough to slip through. They emerged outside the settlement's walls into the frozen forest beyond. Lewis replaced the boards behind them, covering their exit. With luck, it would buy them time before anyone realized they were gone. They moved quickly through the trees, Lewis setting a pace that the children could maintain, but that would maximize their distance from pursuit. He didn't know if the strangers would follow, didn't know if the settlement leader would give them up or try to protect them. He just knew that staying meant risk, and moving meant at least a chance. After an hour of steady travel, Lewis allowed them to stop and rest. They huddled in the shelter of a large tree, catching their breath, listening for sounds of pursuit. There was nothing, just wind and the occasional crack of ice. "Where are we going?" Betika asked, her voice small. Lewis looked out at the endless forest, at the mountains in the distance, at the gray sky that promised more snow. "Away from here," he said, "somewhere they can't find us." "Is there such a place?" Amity asked. Lewis met her eyes, saw the doubt there, the weariness. She was 6 years old now, but her eyes looked ancient. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we keep moving until we find it." They traveled for days, moving from settlement to settlement, staying only long enough to rest and resupply before moving on. Lewis took on jobs where he found them, earning enough to keep them fed and warm, then moving before anyone could start asking questions. The children grew stronger, more capable. Amity was becoming skilled with the knife, her movements precise and confident. Betika was learning too, watching, absorbing, understanding that in this world, knowledge of violence was knowledge of survival. Lewis taught them other things too, how to track game through snow, how to find shelter when none was obvious, how to tell which plants could be eaten and which would kill you, how to read the weather, the terrain, the behavior of other species. Everything he knew, accumulated through years of desperate survival, he passed on to them. They became a strange little unit, this human and two alien children, moving through the frozen wasteland like ghosts. People remembered them when they passed through, the scarred human with cold eyes and the two blue-skinned children who moved like shadows. Stories spread, the human who fought slavers, the man who survived the dead zone, the one who couldn't be bought or intimidated or killed. Spring came eventually, the ice beginning to thaw, the wind losing some of its killing edge. It didn't make survival easy, just slightly less impossible. They kept moving, always moving, staying ahead of whoever might be following. One evening, camped in a cave overlooking a valley, Lewis was cleaning his weapons while the children prepared their meager meal. Amity sat down beside him, no longer a small child, but a young girl now, lean and tough and carrying herself with confidence. "You never told us where you came from," she said. "Before, how you got here." Lewis continued his work, the blade moving steadily. He rarely talked about his past, found it easier to focus on the present. But maybe these children deserved to know. Maybe they had earned it. "I was a prisoner," he said, "being transported to a mining colony. The ship got attacked, broke up in atmosphere. I survived the crash. Most didn't." "What were you imprisoned for?" Lewis smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it. "I killed a man who needed killing. The law disagreed with my assessment." "Do you regret it?" Lewis thought about that. Did he regret taking that life? Did he regret the choices that had led him to that moment? Did he regret the years of violence and survival that had followed? "No," he said finally. "That man was like the slaver, like all the others who use power to hurt people weaker than themselves. The universe is better without him in it." Amity nodded slowly, understanding. "And us? Do you regret saving us?" Lewis looked at her, at this girl he had rescued on impulse, this life he had saved without thinking, this responsibility he had never asked for. Then he looked at Betika, happily stirring their cooking pot, humming tunelessly to herself. He thought about the blood on snow, the moment when something in his chest had cracked open, the decision that had changed everything. "No," Lewis said quietly, "I don't regret it." The months stretched into a year, then longer. The children grew, changed, adapted. Betika remained the lighter spirit, finding joy in small things, keeping them human in a world that tried to strip humanity away. Amity grew serious, focused, driven to become strong enough that no one could ever hurt her again. Lewis grew older, more scarred, more worn. The wound in his shoulder never fully healed, leaving him with occasional pain and reduced strength in that arm. Other injuries accumulated, the price of survival in a harsh world. But he kept going, kept teaching, kept protecting, because that was what he did now. That was who he was. They heard stories about the slavers' organization, about how it had fractured after Varkesh's death, different factions fighting over territory and resources. They heard about settlements being liberated, about slaves being freed, about the old order slowly collapsing. Lewis didn't know if any of it was true, but he liked to think that maybe, somewhere in all that chaos, the children he had saved were part of something larger. A crack in the system, a small rebellion. One day, nearly 2 years after he had thrown that knife across the pavilion, they came to a settlement different from the others. It was larger, more organized, with actual walls instead of scrap metal, with farms and workshops and signs of permanent habitation. The people there moved with purpose rather than desperation. Lewis approached the gate cautiously as always. A guard examined them, noted their weapons, their worn appearance, and called for someone in authority. A woman emerged, human, the first human Lewis had seen in years besides himself. She looked at him with recognition that went beyond the physical. "You're Lewis," she said. It wasn't a question. "You know me?" "Everyone knows you, the human who saved the children, who killed Varkesh, who survived the dead zone." She smiled slightly. "We've been hoping you would find your way here eventually." "What is this place?" "Free settlement. No slaves, no tribute, no masters. We protect our own and we help others who want to be free." She looked at Amini and Bedika, then back at Lewis. "We could use someone like you, if you're interested in staying." Lewis looked at the settlement, at the signs of real civilization, real safety. He looked at the children, saw the hope in their eyes, the possibility of something more than endless running. He thought about the years of survival, of violence, of protecting these two lives at the cost of everything else. "We'll stay," he said, "for a while." The woman nodded, satisfied. "Good, come in. You all look like you could use a decent meal and a real bed." They entered the settlement, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lewis allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, they had found it. The place where running could stop, where they could build something instead of just surviving, where the children could have childhoods, and Lewis could have something other than an endless struggle against a hostile universe. That night, in the small house they had been given, Lewis sat with Amini and Bedika. They were eating real food, sitting at a real table, warm and safe behind real walls. Bedika was smiling, genuinely happy, talking about the other children she had met and the things she wanted to learn. Imani was more reserved, but even she seemed to be relaxing, letting go of some of the constant vigilance that had defined her existence. Lewis watched them, these alien children who had become his family in ways he still didn't fully understand. He thought about the drunk alien who had sold them for one drink, about the emptiness in that creature's eyes, about a father who could abandon his children for a bottle of poison. That alien had been weak, broken by addiction and despair. He had given up everything that mattered for something that meant nothing. He had sold hope for temporary oblivion. But Lewis had given them more than hope. He had given them survival, skills, strength, the knowledge that they could fight back, that they didn't have to accept the cruelty of the universe as inevitable. He had given them proof that sometimes, against all odds, the good guys won, that sometimes the monster got killed and the children survived. And in return, they had given him purpose, a reason to keep fighting, a reminder that he was more than just a survivor, more than just another predator in a world full of predators. They had given him back his humanity. Amini looked up and caught him watching. "What?" she asked. Lewis shook his head. "Nothing, just thinking." "About what?" "About how far we've come." He paused, then added, "About how your father sold you for one drink. About how I gave you a chance at a real life." Amini's expression hardened. "He wasn't our father, not really. A father doesn't do what he did." "No," Lewis agreed, "he doesn't." You're more of a father than he ever was, Betica said suddenly, her voice soft but certain. Lewis felt something catch in his throat. He wasn't anyone's father. He was a killer, a survivor, a man who had done terrible things and would probably do more. He wasn't the kind of person who should be responsible for children. But when he looked at these two girls, at the strength they had developed, at the way they had survived and adapted and grown, he couldn't deny what they were saying. He had saved them. He had protected them. He had taught them. He had been there day after day, keeping them alive when the whole universe seemed determined to kill them. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what being a father really meant. Not biology, not intention, but action. Being there when it mattered. Doing what needed to be done. Get some sleep, Lewis said, his voice rough. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to live here. Real living, not just surviving. The children nodded and headed to their room. Lewis sat alone in the main room, listening to their quiet voices as they settled in for the night. He cleaned his weapons one more time, the ritual that had kept him sane through years of violence and chaos. Outside, the wind howled, but inside they were warm. Outside, the world was harsh and unforgiving, but inside they were safe. For now, for tonight, maybe for longer. Lewis allowed himself to hope, just a little. Hope was dangerous. Hope could get you killed. But maybe after everything, he had earned the right to a little dangerous hope. 3 months passed in relative peace. Lewis worked on the settlement's defenses, reinforcing weak points in the walls, training volunteers in basic combat techniques. The settlement leader, whose name was Norbert, was a practical man who understood that freedom meant constant vigilance. He gave Lewis authority over security, trusting the human's experience and instincts. Amini trained every day, her movements becoming faster, more precise. She was 8 now, tall for her age, with muscles developing from constant practice. Lewis pushed her hard, knowing that skill meant survival, that hesitation meant death. She never complained, never asked to stop. She attacked the training post with focused intensity. Each strike meant to kill. Betica was different. She was gentler, more interested in healing than hurting. The settlement's medic, an older alien woman named Melinda, had taken her under wing, teaching her about plants and medicines and how to treat wounds. But Lewis made sure she trained too, made sure she knew how to defend herself when words and kindness weren't enough. The settlement was growing, refugees arriving regularly, people fleeing slavery and oppression, looking for a place where they could live free. Each new arrival was carefully vetted, questioned, watched. Trust was earned slowly here, because one spy, one traitor, could destroy everything they were building. Lewis was checking the eastern wall one morning when he heard the alarm bell. 3 sharp rings, then a pause, then 3 more. Raiders. He grabbed his weapons and ran toward the main gate where Norbert was already organizing defenders. How many? Lewis demanded. 20, maybe more, Norbert said, his face grim. They're testing us, seeing if we're worth raiding. Lewis climbed to the wall and surveyed the attackers. They were a mixed group, various species, all armed with crude weapons. Not professional soldiers, just opportunists who thought a settlement of refugees would be easy prey. They were spread out, approaching cautiously, probably expecting minimal resistance. Archers, Lewis called out. Wait for my signal. The settlement had 10 people who could use bows with any competency. Not many, but it would have to be enough. Lewis watched the raiders advance, waiting, timing it. When they were 50 meters out, close enough for accurate shots but far enough that they couldn't immediately rush the walls, Lewis gave the signal. Arrows flew. 3 raiders went down immediately, 2 more were wounded. The attackers scattered, looking for cover, their confidence shaken. Lewis grabbed a bow from a nearby defender and took his own shot, the arrow punching through a raider's shoulder and dropping him. Hold positions, Lewis ordered. Let them think, let them doubt. The raiders regrouped, their leader shouting orders. Lewis studied the man, noting his size, his weapons, his body language. Experienced fighter. This wasn't his first raid. He would adapt, adjust tactics, try something different. The second attack came from 2 directions simultaneously, half the raiders feinting at the main gate, while the others tried to scale the eastern wall using crude ladders. Lewis had anticipated this. He sent half the defenders to the eastern wall while he stayed at the gate. The raiders at the gate were making noise, trying to draw attention, but they weren't committing to a real assault. Lewis ignored them, focusing on the sounds from the eastern wall, shouting the thud of bodies hitting the ground, screams of pain. The defenders were holding, but barely. Lewis ran along the wall toward the fighting. Two raiders had made it over, were engaging the defenders in brutal close combat. Lewis didn't slow down. He vaulted over a barrel, drew his sword, and hit the first raider like a charging bull. The impact sent them both tumbling, but Lewis recovered first, driving his blade through the raider's chest before the alien could defend himself. The second raider turned to face Lewis, swinging a heavy axe. Lewis ducked under the swing, came up inside the raider's guard, and headbutted him. Bone crunched. Lewis followed with a knee to the groin and an elbow to the back of the neck. The raider collapsed. More raiders were climbing the ladders. Lewis grabbed one ladder and pushed, using his strength and leverage to topple it backward. The raiders on it fell with screams of terror, hitting the ground hard. Another ladder, another push. This one fought back, raiders trying to hold it steady from below, but Lewis kept pushing until it too fell. An arrow whistled past his head, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. Lewis dropped flat as more arrows came, the raiders below trying to pin him down. He crawled to the nearest archer, a young alien named Linda, who was shaking so badly she could barely hold her bow. "Breathe," Lewis said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Pick a target, one target. Focus only on him. When you're ready, release." Linda took a shaking breath, knocked an arrow, drew, and released. The arrow flew wide. Lewis didn't criticize, didn't show disappointment. "Again, you'll get closer this time." She did. The second arrow came closer. The third hit a raider in the leg. Linda looked at Lewis with surprise and growing confidence. Lewis nodded and moved on, checking the other defenders, offering encouragement, adjusting positions. The raiders pulled back, dragging their wounded with them. They gathered at a safe distance, arguing among themselves. Lewis could see the dissent in their ranks, the doubt. They had expected an easy target and found organized resistance. The question was whether they would cut their losses or double down. The raider leader made his decision. He raised his weapon and bellowed a war cry, charging directly at the main gate with his remaining forces following. No subtlety, no tactics, just raw aggression. Lewis ran back to the gate, arriving just as the first raiders hit the wooden barrier. The gate was strong, reinforced with metal and cross-braced, but it wouldn't hold forever under determined assault. Lewis positioned defenders at the walls beside the gate, armed with spears and rocks, anything that could be thrown or thrust at the attackers below. A raider appeared at the top of the wall, having climbed up using a grappling hook. Lewis was there in an instant, grabbing the raider's weapon hand and twisting, using the alien's momentum to flip him over the wall and back down onto his companions. Another raider climbed up on the opposite side. Lewis threw his knife, the blade embedding itself in the raider's throat. The alien fell backward with a gurgling scream. The gate was starting to splinter under the assault. Lewis grabbed a heavy beam that had been prepared for exactly this situation and called for help. 3 defenders joined him, and together they dropped the beam into position behind the gate, bracing it. The gate held. But the raiders were relentless now, committed to the attack. They were piling debris against the wall, trying to build a ramp. Lewis looked around for something to stop them, saw a barrel of lamp oil, and made a quick decision. He grabbed the barrel, hauled it to the wall, and poured the oil down onto the debris pile. Then he lit a torch and dropped it. The fire erupted with a whoosh, flames climbing 20 feet high, engulfing the debris and forcing the raiders to scatter. Several were caught in the flames, their screams terrible. The rest pulled back, their assault broken, their will shattered. The raider leader stood in the open, watching his plan collapse, watching his warriors flee. He looked up at the wall, at Lewis standing there silhouetted against the flames, and their eyes met. Lewis saw the calculation in the raider's expression, the weighing of options. Then the leader turned and walked away, following his retreating forces. Lewis stayed on the wall until the raiders were out of sight, making sure it wasn't a feint, that they were truly leaving. Only when he was certain did he allow himself to relax, to feel the exhaustion and adrenaline crash that came after combat. "Get the wounded to Melinda," Lewis ordered. "Check the walls for damage. Double the watch tonight." Norbert appeared beside him, looking shaken but proud. We held. Because of you. We held because everyone did their job, Lewis corrected. But they'll be back. Maybe not these raiders, but others. Word will spread that we have something worth taking. Then we'll be ready. Lewis nodded, but his mind was already working ahead, planning, preparing. Defense wasn't enough. They needed to be stronger, better organized, more capable. He started making a mental list of improvements, weaknesses to address, training that needed to happen. He found Amini and Batika near the eastern wall, both of them tall but unharmed. Amini had her knife out, had been ready to fight if the raiders breached the walls. Batika had been helping Melinda treat wounded defenders, her small hands surprisingly steady as she held bandages and passed tools. You did good, Lewis told them, both of you. That night, the settlement gathered in the main hall. There was no celebration, no joy in their victory. 3 defenders had died, 7 more were wounded, but they had survived, had driven off raiders who could have destroyed them. That counted for something. Lewis stood at the back of the hall, watching the people talk quietly among themselves, sharing stories, offering comfort. He saw community forming, bonds being created through shared struggle. This was what he had fought for, what he continued to fight for. Not abstract concepts of freedom or justice, but this, real people living real lives, free from chains. Over the following weeks, Lewis intensified the training program. Every able-bodied person in the settlement spent at least 2 hours each day learning to fight, learning to defend. Amni became his assistant instructor, demonstrating techniques, sparring with new trainees. She was patient but demanding, reflecting Lewis's own teaching style. More refugees arrived, including a family of 4 that Norbert brought to meet Lewis personally. The father was human, the first human Lewis had encountered in the settlement, besides the leader who had initially welcomed them. His name was Jerome, and he had been a soldier back on Earth before the transport crash that stranded him here. I heard about you, Jerome said, shaking Lewis's hand with a grip that spoke of real strength. The human who killed Varkesh, who saved the children, who survived the dead zone. Stories get exaggerated, Lewis said, not these ones. Jerome's expression grew serious. I want to help. I want to fight. This place, what you're building here, it matters. I'll do whatever you need. Lewis studied the man, reading his body language, his tone, his eyes. Jerome was genuine, a soldier looking for a cause worth fighting for. Lewis could use someone like that. You have combat experience? 10 years in the infantry, 2 tours, hand-to-hand specialist. Good. I need someone to train the close-quarters fighters. Most of the people here have never thrown a punch in their lives. Jerome smiled grimly. I can work with that. The settlement's defenses grew stronger. The walls were reinforced with sharpened stakes, creating a killing zone for anyone who tried to approach. Trenches were dug outside the walls, hidden under thin layers of branches and snow. Watchtowers were built at the corners, giving defenders a clear field of fire. Lewis was turning the settlement into a fortress. But defense was only part of the solution. The settlement needed resources: food, medicine, weapons, materials for building and repair. That meant trade, which meant sending people outside the walls, which meant risk. Lewis organized scouting parties, small groups that could move quickly, gather what was needed, and return before being noticed. Amini went on her first scouting mission when she turned 9. Lewis went with her, along with Jerome and 2 other experienced fighters. Their target was an abandoned outpost 2 days' travel to the north, rumored to have supplies left behind when the previous inhabitants fled raiders. The journey was uneventful, which made Lewis nervous. In this world, quiet usually meant trouble was waiting. They approached the outpost cautiously, spreading out, watching for ambushes. The place looked deserted, its walls broken, its buildings collapsed. But Lewis's instincts were screaming warnings. Stay here, he told Amini. Watch the perimeter. Signal if you see movement. Lewis and Jerome entered the outpost, weapons ready, moving slowly through the ruins. They found the supplies quickly, crates of dried food and medical equipment that someone had stored and never retrieved. Too easy. Far too easy. Trap, Jerome said quietly, reaching the same conclusion Lewis had. They heard the click at the same moment. the subtle sound of a tripwire being released. Lewis threw himself backward, tackling Jerome, as the building exploded. Not with fire, but with a collapse, the weakened supports giving way, the roof coming down in a controlled demolition designed to kill anyone inside. Lewis and Jerome hit the ground outside the building just as it fell, debris raining around them. Lewis rolled, came up running, grabbing Jerome and pulling him clear. Behind them, where they had been standing seconds ago, tons of wood and metal created a cloud of dust and destruction. Figures appeared from hiding spots around the outpost. 8 of them, heavily armed, moving with military precision. This wasn't random raiders. This was an organized ambush, bait in a trap designed to catch scavengers. Amini's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. "Contact right, 3 more!" Lewis spun, saw the 3 attackers moving toward where Amini and the others waited. "Jerome, hold them!" Then Lewis was running, drawing his sword, racing to reach Amini before the attackers did. The first attacker never saw Lewis coming. Lewis hit him at full speed, driving his shoulder into the alien's back and sending him sprawling. The second turned to face Lewis, bringing up a spear. Lewis batted it aside with his sword and kicked the attacker's knee, folding the joint backward with a crack. The third tried to run. Lewis threw his knife, the blade catching the fleeing figure between the shoulder blades. He turned back to see Amini engaged with one of the original 8 attackers, her small size making her difficult to hit, her knife flashing as she darted in and out, cutting, retreating, cutting again. Lewis started toward her, then stopped. She had this. She was handling it. He had trained her for this exact situation. The attacker was getting frustrated, his swings becoming wild. Amini waited for the opening, timed it perfectly, and drove her knife up under the attacker's arm where the armor didn't protect. The alien screamed and dropped his weapon. Amini kicked his legs out from under him and was on him instantly. She met his throat. "Yield," she hissed. The attacker yielded. Jerome was holding his own against 3 attackers, his military training evident in every efficient movement. Lewis joined him, and together they drove the attackers back, not killing, but disabling, breaking limbs and destroying weapons. Within minutes, the ambush was broken, the surviving attackers fleeing into the wilderness. Lewis checked his people. Minor injuries, nothing serious. They had survived another test, learned another lesson. The outpost was a loss, the supplies too dangerous to retrieve, but they had gained something more valuable: experience. Confirmation that their training was working, that they could handle unexpected threats. On the return journey, Lewis walked beside Amini. She was quiet, processing what had happened, what she had done. She had killed before, in training accidents and in defense of the settlement, but this was different. This was combat, a real fight where hesitation meant death. "You did well," Lewis said. "I was scared," Amini admitted. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. It's not about not being scared. It's about functioning despite the fear." "Did you teach me to kill?" Lewis considered the question. "I taught you to survive. Killing is sometimes part of that, but it's not the goal. The goal is living. Understanding?" Amini nodded slowly. Understanding. Back at the settlement, word of the successful defense and the ambush survival spread quickly. Lewis's reputation grew, and with it came attention. Not all of it welcome. Traders began stopping at the settlement, drawn by rumors of wealth and security. Some were legitimate, offering fair deals on goods and information. Others were scouts, gathering intelligence for larger groups. One trader in particular caught Lewis's attention. He was human, which was rare enough, but there was something about him that set Lewis's instincts on alert. The man called himself Nicholas, claimed to be a free trader operating between settlements. His prices were too good, his knowledge too detailed, his interest in the settlement's defenses too keen. Lewis followed Nicholas one night as the trader left the settlement. Nicholas didn't go far, just to a small camp hidden in a nearby ravine. Lewis watched from concealment as Nicholas met with a group of well-armed aliens, reporting on what he had seen, providing details about guard rotations and weak points. Lewis had seen enough. He returned to the settlement and reported to Norbert. "The trader is a spy. He's working with raiders, probably for a cut of whatever they take." "We should arrest him," Norbert said. "No, we should use him. Let him think we don't know. Feed him false information. When the raiders come, and they will come, we'll be ready for them." Norbert agreed. For the next week, Lewis made sure Nicholas saw exactly what Lewis wanted him to see. Guards in wrong positions, supplies stored in vulnerable locations, weapons poorly maintained. All of it fiction. All of it designed to give the raiders false confidence. The attack came 8 days later, at dawn, exactly when Nicholas had reported the guards would be changing shifts and the settlement would be most vulnerable. What the raiders found instead was a fully armed and positioned defense, with every fighter alert and ready. Lewis didn't lead from the walls this time. He led a counterattack, taking 20 volunteers out through a hidden gate, circling around to hit the raiders from behind while they were focused on the main walls. Jerome led the flanking group, hitting them from the other side. The raiders found themselves caught in a three-way trap, with defenders firing from the walls, Lewis's group attacking from the rear, and Jerome's team closing the third side. The fight was brutal and short. The raiders broke quickly, their leadership collapsing under the unexpected resistance. Those who could flee did. Those who couldn't were captured or killed. By the time the sun was fully up, it was over. Nicholas tried to flee during the confusion, but Amini had been watching him specifically. She cut him off at the hidden gate, her knife in hand, her eyes cold. Nicholas tried to talk his way out, offering information, money, anything. Amini didn't respond, just held her position until Lewis arrived. Lewis looked at Nicholas with no expression. "You sold us for profit. How many settlements have you betrayed?" Nicholas's face went pale. "I'm just trying to survive. We all do what we have to do." "No," Lewis said quietly. "We don't. Some things are worth dying for. Some lines you don't cross." He turned to Norbert, who had joined them. "Your settlement, your justice." Norbert's face was hard. "Exile, take what you can carry. If you come back, we kill you." Nicholas was stripped of his weapons, given basic supplies, and sent into the wilderness. Lewis watched him go, knowing the man probably wouldn't survive long out there alone. But that wasn't his concern. His concern was the settlement, the people he had sworn to protect. Months passed. The settlement grew stronger, more organized, more capable. Raiders learned to avoid the place, knowing that easy prey they expected would cost them dearly. Refugees continued to arrive, and Lewis continued to train them, to forge them into defenders. Amini was 10 now, no longer a child in any meaningful sense. She moved like a fighter, thought like a strategist, carried herself with the confidence of someone who had survived and would continue surviving. Bedica was 8, quieter but no less capable in her own way, her knowledge of medicine saving lives that would have been lost. Lewis was scarred, worn, older than his years, but he was alive. And more than that, he had found something he thought was lost forever. Purpose, community, family. The children he had saved on impulse had become his daughters in every way that mattered. The settlement he had helped defend had become his home. Standing on the wall one evening, watching the sun set over the frozen landscape, Lewis allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about the pavilion where this had all started, about blue blood on white snow, about the choice he had made without thinking. That choice had changed everything, had led him here, to this moment, to this life. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Amini and Bedica approaching. They stood beside him, the three of them looking out at the wilderness together. A strange family, forged not by blood, but by survival, by shared struggle, by choice. "What are you thinking about?" Amini asked. Lewis smiled slightly. "How a drunk alien sold you for one drink, and how I gave you more than hope." "You gave us everything," Bedica said softly. Lewis shook his head. "You gave me everything. Before you, I was just surviving, just waiting to die. You reminded me what living actually means." They stood together in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the settlement's lights came on below them, warm points of life in the cold night. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever challenges waited in the frozen wasteland beyond their walls, they would face it together. And that, Lewis thought, was enough.